very existence is wrapped up in the things you are here to fulfill. Whatever you choose for a career path, remember the struggles along the way are only meant to shape you for your purpose.
Welcome to In Bloom. I am your host, Mikaela Richmond, and this is a pro-humanity podcast.
Hello there. On today's episode, I interview Steve Patterson. Steve Patterson is, in my opinion, a raging intellectual. He is so smart. He is very committed to his search for the truth, and that is blatantly obvious through our discussion. So we talk a lot about philosophy. That's a lot of the initial conversation. Underpinning everything that he goes into, it's a lot of philosophy. But the cool thing is that philosophy is just about the search for wisdom, the search for truth, and the way that a philosopher goes about understanding the world is by questioning even the most foundational beliefs. Like, philosophers want to get to the heart of truth, and so they will take and deconstruct accepted truths and try to really understand them. So that's really apparent through his work. I will put a link in the description to an article that I wrote about this and about why I think that philosophy is actually incredibly necessary to do good in the world. But yeah, no, I hope y'all enjoy this episode. We talked about a lot of different things. We talked about a lot of philosophy. We mentioned some things about religion. I was very fascinated by what he had to say in terms of the future of the world. We talked a lot about where he sees the world going, why he sees the world going that way. I asked him a couple of questions in regards to the last episode that I put out. And also, we actually talked a little bit about the Matrix. So I hope you enjoy this episode. It's a really good one. You can find Steve Patterson on his website, steve-patterson.com. He hosts a podcast called Patterson In Pursuit, and he loves to interview very intelligent people about big ideas. He has a book called Square One, The Foundations of Knowledge, which he references a couple of times. And it's basically just about foundational ideas, how he came to his conclusions, what those foundational ideas are, and this is a fascinating one. I hope that y'all enjoy it. All right, so today I have on Steve Patterson. I am so glad to have you on my podcast to discuss all things foundational philosophy. Steve is so adamant about searching for the truth, and I really appreciate that. So welcome, Steve.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, okay, today we're going to talk about all things foundational philosophy. I guess to begin, why does philosophy matter?
Well, the way I see it, we act based on the ideas that we hold, whether those ideas are examined or unexamined. And the more I've examined my own ideas, the more I'm thinking, oh, okay, I need further investigation into figuring out why I believe what I believe, because it affects my action. All of my actions, from what I can tell, ultimately derive from my beliefs about the world. So if you care about, skillful living and not making unnecessary blunders that might cause unnecessary suffering, then I think philosophy is critically important.
How did you grow up? Was that like, did that help in getting you to where you are now? Or I don't know, would somebody expect that?
Yeah, so I grew up in like a Christian evangelical household. It was my mother in particular was very open to skeptical inquiry. She was all about, in her religion, in her religious view, truth and evangelical Christianity were the same thing. And that meant she wasn't scared of investigation or critical thinking at all. She was like, look, and ask whatever questions you have to ask. She just thought it's going to end up in evangelical Christianity, which it didn't end up there. But I have a lot of respect for her openness to seeking the truth. And like I remember, my dad and I would sometimes get in more heated conversations, and my dad had some interesting philosophical ideas about the nature of truth, where he sometimes would hint at the idea that truth couldn't be known, ultimately have to have faith in things. And I did not agree with that idea. And I remember talking to my mother about it, and she was like, yeah, the truth can be known, because she thought the truth of Christianity can be known, so therefore truth must be known. And just totally encouraged all of the skeptical inquiry, even if it was aggressive, even if sometimes I was dipping into heresy, she was open to it. So I think I think that sort of laid the foundations for a general philosophical approach to things. And also, like when I was young, I was really interested in politics or political theory, I guess. And for many years, I thought, okay, this is helping me explain the world through politics. And then I realized, oh, underpinning politics and political ideas are economic ideas. I thought, actually, if you really want to know how the world works, you got to dive into economics. So I did that for several years. And then when I was really into economics, I thought, underpinning economics is the methodology of economics. How do you go about doing economics? Like we make economic propositions, okay, but how can we claim that we have this knowledge? How do we get this economic knowledge? And that's a very philosophical question, and that just sucked me ultimately into philosophy, the most broad investigation of things. How do we get any knowledge whatsoever about anything? Can we know anything with certainty, or is all of our knowledge contingent? Those types of questions. So that's ultimately sort of the route that landed me firmly in philosophy.
You mentioned truth. You mentioned that your father did not believe that truth could be discovered, and your mother said it
like
could
that.
be.
Yeah, something like that.
What is truth?
So the way I think of truth is that truth is the way things actually are. So though I think there is a state of the universe, things are some particular way. And when you're talking about truth, you might call this metaphysical truth, although maybe you don't need that adjective. You're just describing the way things actually are. Linguistic truth can be understood as true sentences about the way things are. So for example, if I have a cat and there's a cat sitting on a chair, the metaphysical truth is the fact of the cat being on the chair. It's just the universe is some particular way, and the way that it is right now is that there is a cat on a chair. A linguistic truth would be the sentence, there is a cat sitting on the chair. And the reason the sentence is true is because in reality, there's an actual state out there, which is the cat sitting on the chair. So that's how I think about truth. And I think, when I look back on the heated conversations I have with my father sometimes, I think ultimately he would probably agree with that, but it would be selective agreement, because when he was losing the argument, he might appeal to the idea that you couldn't know truth. And then maybe, as he was about to go to sleep, he was thinking about these things, he might be open to the idea that you could actually know truth. But it was difficult to concede, because then he'd have to admit his son was right about a bunch of things, which he didn't want to do.
That's so funny. Okay, so where did your I guess discovery of truth take you? Where did you begin? How did you go about coming to this conclusion?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So I assumed it for many years, and I thought, of course you can know truth. And it's sort of underpinning all the other investigations I'm doing is that truth could be known. And then I remember, I remember being in Florida at some point. I want to say I was 18 or something. And I was writing notes to myself, maybe I was 16. And I thought, okay, how do I know that things are true? And I remember writing down somewhere like A is A, like a thing is a thing. Whatever a thing is, that's the way that it is. That's got to be true. I thought, yeah, okay, so maybe logic, that's like a logically necessary claim. A is A. Whatever something is, that's the way it is. I remember thinking, okay, well, logic then is one way that we can discover truth. I thought that's really cool. Fast forward a few years, then I was living in New York. I thought, but hang on a second, why do I think logic gives me the truth? Like, why shouldn't it be that there are logical contradictions out there? And then I remember going, oh no, maybe I'm just assuming something that doesn't actually hold. Maybe I thought logic was the secret to critical thinking, and I have no justification for it. So that's then I came to a conclusion that was the subject of my book, Square One: The Foundations of Knowledge, which makes the claim that the reason that logic leads to truth, or can, if it's very carefully applied, is that logic and existence are inseparable. And so Square One is specifically investigating this idea. Like, can we know ultimate truth? Yes. I think logic and existence are inseparable is something that is universally true. And from there, I've sort of just been building out from there. So I think there are other ways of knowing truth. Like, for example, the truth of the nature of my experiences is something that I don't logically derive. It's just, I can say, I am having the experience of looking into a laptop right now, or if I want to be very precise, I am having an experience that I'm interpreting as looking into a laptop right now. And that's true. That's certainly true. How do I know? Well, because I'm having the experience. I have direct access to the truth of the nature of my experiences. I have to be careful because we can interpret our experiences incorrectly. Like maybe I'm hallucinating. Maybe I accidentally took some magic mushrooms, somebody put them in my tea, and like all of this is in my head, or I'm dreaming. So maybe I'm not actually looking into a laptop. That's possible, but I'm still having the experience, even if I'm interpreting the experience incorrectly. So as far as I can tell, there's at least two methods of getting at rock solid truth, which is talking about or being aware of the nature of your direct experiences and careful applications of logic. And both together, I think you can build out a little bit of coherent philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have two questions. Number one, what is logic? Because I think that will help.
So it depends on who you ask. For me, and I go into this a little bit in the book, I think that logic is the rules of existence. And I identify with three, you could say two, depending on how particular you want to be. The law of identity and the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. That one has a little asterisk by it. It's a little technical. We don't have to go into it. The law of identity simply says that things are the way that they are. A is A cat is a cat, a square is a square, a blade of grass is a blade of grass. Whatever something is, that's the way it is. And the law of non-contradiction says it would be false to claim that something is the way that it is not. So if you say the square is a circle, that's not true. If you say the blade of grass is not a blade of grass, that's not true. So it's just those two simple things. I think these are laws of the universe. I think they're necessary features of the universe that nothing violates. There's nothing out there which is a logical contradiction. That is to say, there's nothing that is in a state that it's not in. Which depending on your philosophical orientation, that might sound totally trivial and ridiculous, or it might sound very profound. A lot of people, like I remember after I wrote Square One, I was talking to my grandmother about this, and she was like, well, that's just too sophisticated for me. And I said, no, that's not what's going on. I said, you already know this. This is so trivially true. You just don't believe that I'm stating something that's so trivially obvious. And the reason I have to state it is because people are so confused in our modern times that they think there are logical contradictions. They think that there are things that are somehow not the way that they are, or that there can, things can be in a paradoxical state of being and non-being at the same time. Things are so bad that I have to write a book explaining that no, things are the way that they are, and they aren't the way that they are not.
Okay, you talked about paradoxes, and you said that paradoxes don't exist, and I thought that was fascinating. Explain to me a couple of paradoxes that people think are very adamant exist that you were like, no, incorrect.
Well, there's several. Let's see, what's a good one to start? This is a fun one to start. You might have heard of Schrodinger's cat. Have people talked about? Okay, so this is a funny story. So there's this idea in physics, and we'll keep this fair. Don't have to go into technical detail here. It's popular in the 20th century, called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Wow, it sounds impressive. This is the core concept. The idea is that reality isn't in some particular state prior to our measurement of it. That's kind of the essence. Now, there was a physicist named Schrodinger who came along and came up with a thought experiment that said, well, if what you guys were saying were true, then we could have this situation in which we have a cat that's both alive and dead at the same time until you check whether it's alive or dead, and then it takes one particular state or the other. Now, he came up with this thought experiment to show that the Copenhagen interpretation was nonsense, because it leads to a paradox. You can't have a cat that's alive and dead at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. If it's alive, it's not dead. If it's dead, it's not alive. That's what we mean. So over time, through some intellectual catastrophe, the example of Schrodinger's cat has been people try to bring it up to show the magic and mystery of quantum mechanics. That no, you see, this is a real paradox out there. Quantum mechanics, quantum physics is amazing and crazy and wild, just like Schrodinger's cat's alive and dead. So that would be an example that's a particularly relevant example, because that one comes up a lot. And the guy that came up with the thought experiment was saying, listen, I'm coming up with this thought experiment to show why your ideas are wrong. And then people go, no, this is proof that, there's magic in the world. So that would be one. Another example, I actually had a conversation with a professor at Columbia who we were talking about the philosophy of mathematics. And he was giving examples in math of logical contradictions that are used. So he was saying some logical contradictions are okay, like the idea of an infinite set. the idea that you can have a set of numbers that are with an infinite amount of numbers. He was saying, well, that's kind of logically contradictory. And yet we use it in math, so I guess we have to be cool with logical contradictions. That's a very interesting example, because there's some, he's pointing at something that that really needs to be addressed. But there are, without going into detail, there are plenty of ways to resolve that apparent paradox. So everywhere that people bring up paradoxes, they say this is paradoxical, there's Zeno's paradox, there's a bunch of paradoxes. These are all apparent paradoxes that if you apply enough conceptual analysis to, you find they all get resolved, all of them. So there are paradoxes in the sense that you can say paradoxical things, that you can come up with puzzles that don't have easy resolutions. The liar's paradox is one. If I say this sentence is false, is that true or is it false? Well, if it's true that this sentence is false, then it's false. But if it's false that the sentence is false, then it's true. So it's true and it's false at the same time. That's a mind bender. And there are actually some people who have said there must be logical contradictions out there that are inescapable, and they appeal to things like the liar's paradox. But again, if you sit down and take the time, you can sort through these things and all of them get resolved. And there's a sense in which, this is something the argument I make in my book, all of them have to be resolved. If you actually understand that there are no logical contradictions and why there are no logical contradictions, it's not a surprise that all paradoxes, no matter how difficult, can ultimately be resolved, because reality is the way that it is. It's just in a state that it is in. It's not in some contradictory state.
Okay, so a couple of things. First, the Schrodinger's cat example is pretty much the exact same thing as if a tree falls, does it actually, and it doesn't make a sound, or what, that one tree example that I was told in kindergarten.
It's a little bit different than that one. It's a lot worse, actually. Let's explore that just for a minute. So, interesting question, right? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it make a sound? So I like this puzzle, because it's really asking the question, are there sounds without minds?
Interesting.
Yeah, and some people have said, yes, there are sounds because there are sound waves, and a sound is identical to a sound wave. And other people say, well, no, the sound isn't the sound wave, it's the experience. It's the conscious experience. So if you don't have consciousness around, then there's no sound. There might be sound waves, but there's no sound. That's the position I take. So this is, the Copenhagen, it's a wonderful philosophical puzzle. And philosophers have disagreed about this. Some people, and you could also say the same thing about color, for example. If there are no minds, are there still colors in the world? Or are the colors only experiential? You have to have consciousness to have color. You can still have wavelength, but is that the same thing as color? Interesting question. But so that's fun. The Copenhagen thing is not even close to that level of respectability. This is like, if I explained it, it's far more preposterous than the tree falling in the forest question.
That's funny. Okay. My second question. Okay, so whenever you explain these things, I imagine that because in the few moments whenever I have experienced something that is philosophically difficult to comprehend, I usually have a moment where I question my existence and it gets really trippy.
Yeah.
How do you get out of that?
Oh, yeah. So that's a good question. So philosophy is really heavy.
Heavy.
When you get into some questions about the nature of the self, what am I? What is consciousness? It's really hard. And you can also very quickly bump into questions that if you were to ask normal people, they'd say, are you crazy? Are you smoking something? Which is also hard to deal with. If there's social stigma on asking, if you run to your friend and say, what am I? I'm not sure they're going to look at you like you're sane. Like, what do you mean? What are you? But if you take them seriously, they're incredibly difficult. I can't give universal advice here, because I think actually there's some subset of people that probably shouldn't think about these questions, because they're not grounded enough, I guess. And I think it can really disturb them. I would say, I don't know what the signs of that would be. But for me, I found that, one thing that has been super helpful is like the ideas in Square One, for example. At the end of the day, I think everything makes sense. So I don't know if we can know everything about the universe, but I think because of the relationship between logic and existence, everything is knowable in principle, everything is orderly in principle. And I think it has to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of calming, that no matter what I'm bumping into, even if something's like, I don't exist, or whatever philosophical rabbit hole you go down to, at the end of the day, it's okay. It's just reality is in the state that it's in, whatever the truth of things is, reality is that way. Just being aware of it, isn't the worst thing in the world. But I should also say, like, there are real dangers in this. So the question of the ego is something that comes up a lot in different philosophies, and the nature of the self. There are lots and lots of people who have reported for various reasons that they get ego disillusion. Like, I stopped being me and I started being part of my environment. Or like, I was walking out in the woods and I became the trees. And that's kind of hard to understand, but they're trying to communicate something about the nature of their experiences, which I think is very profound and can be life-changing for people who have religious experiences, spiritual experiences that are closely connected with their conception of self. So that being said, though that is very scary, I think that for some people that can be part of the path that they're supposed to be on, is to have some of those difficult realizations if they have to be had, and find a way to integrate them into their life. I wish I had an easy answer for you here, but I would say, at the end of the day, I don't think there are boogeymen in reality and truth. I think truth is good. And even if we have to overturn a bunch of our deeply cherished concepts, I think truth wins out and it's good at the end of the day. So I don't think there's anything to fear fundamentally.
Okay, what do you mean by boogeyman? Like what are you referring to in terms of fearing?
So imagine philosophically that there is no thing that is fundamentally unifying your mind together. Let's say, like, at the end of the day, yourself is just a concept. And if you stop conceiving of yourself, that thing goes away. Now,
okay, interesting.
So for me, when I think about that, I go, that's very scary. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I kind of like thinking of myself as a self. I'm not saying this is true, by the way. I'm just saying entertain this as a philosophy. I don't actually think that's true. But when I think about questions like that, I'm like, oh, I don't even know what my boundaries are. I don't even know what I am. Like that causes me anxiety. It would just be one example. There's also other there's other scary questions out there you can ask about the nature of souls. So growing up in the Christian evangelical household, I was told a lot of ideas about what happens after you die, and what happens after you die depends on your behavior in the world, and what if you don't behave the right way. So if you seriously entertain ideas of heaven and hell, which I think can be seriously entertained, those are very scary. The very scary ideas, if they turn out to be true. I don't want to burn in hell for eternity. That sounds terrible. So I sort of have to sit down and think through some of these ideas so I don't accidentally end up dying and then being tortured for eternity. That wouldn't be pleasant.
So you do believe in a heaven and a hell?
I'm not sure. I'm just saying the idea should be seriously entertained.
Okay, so
if I had to bet, I would say I can easily rescue the concepts of heaven and hell when you apply them to living in the world at present. So I think there are states, like, for example, I had these wonderful states of love with my spouse. I would say that you could be described as heaven. And I also think, when there's this quote from I forget who says that war is hell. And I think you could make a compelling case that we humans have the ability to bring about heaven and hell on earth. That would be an easy way to rescue the concept. And in terms of the more traditional heaven and hell, I'm definitely more skeptical. I'm definitely more skeptical of that. It's possible, but I don't personally, I don't think that quite works.
Interesting. And why doesn't it work?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons. One is I think let's see how to put it. I think when engaging with religious ideas, as I've been doing for the last several years, there's a way of interpreting religious claims which is a lot more philosophically palatable than the more traditional ways. So let me give you one example, and it will tie it back to heaven and hell. So when I think of the concept of God, there's one conception, which is God is a person, a divine person that has created everything. Totally logically possible from what I can tell. But there's another conception of God, which is a more naturalistic conception. It says, what if we use the word God to describe the entirety of the universe? Like absolutely, take absolutely everything together, and you call that God. Well, if we do that, we get to say theological sounding things. Like I can rescue the concept of omniscience and omnipotence, omnipresence, the traditional attributes of God, with this naturalistic conception. So God is everywhere. I heard this a million times growing up. God is everywhere. He watches you when you pee, right? Like God is everywhere. Well, if God is synonymous with the universe, God is literally everywhere. Like by definition, everywhere that there is something, there is a part of the universe. So God is literally everywhere if we use that conception. God is omniscient. That means God knows everything. Well, there's a sense in which there's no information that's kept from the universe. The whole, like everything that exists in the universe and is known figuratively by the universe. There's no magic and mystery state of the universe that is somehow outside the universe or isn't like participating in the system. So when I do that, I go, okay, well, that's a really interesting conception of God. And it's profound, true. You can think of the universe in meaningful ways here. It's like, oh, dang, I am actually part of the universe. I don't know whether I'm a part of God, but if we define God as the universe, I have a very interesting relationship with God or with the rest of the universe. I am part of the system. So that's cool. So anyway, getting back to heaven and hell, I have found that there are lots of traditionally religious ideas which can be reinterpreted through the naturalistic lens, and it makes so much sense to me. That's sort of where I'm defaulting to right now. So with heaven and hell, I think, well, because I think I can make sense of these concepts in the non-traditional sense. That's where I default. Like I would need more evidence and argument that the evangelical conception of heaven and hell are true in order for me to believe them. I'm open to the idea that these things exist, but I also think there's a lot of power in thinking about these concepts in more naturalistic terms. And I think that's the case with like, just to go with Christianity here, right? The nature of Jesus. There, in where I was raised, the community I was raised, Jesus was a person. There was a historical person. We tell a story about the actions of the person. There's another more naturalistic interpretation here, which I think of Jesus as being a mental state that is accessible to everybody. It is a religious state of love, something like that. If that's the case, currently that is actually what I think. Okay. Yes, but I'm illustrating the point that when you think of things this way, it actually has lots of profound, like spiritual weight to it. And because that's the case, I'm not eager to conclude one way or another on the traditional theological concepts.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's sort of the conception of heaven and hell. I'm like, look, we can get there. Maybe we can get there. I'm open to it, but let's start with this other way of talking about things first. And then if we need to add more concepts on to build back the traditional conception, I'm open to that too.
No, I like that. That's very, very true to your specialty as a philosopher. You have to go to the very bottom and then not accept anything until it builds up to it, which is respectable.
Essentially, yeah. That this is something that I learned. So not to go too hardcore in the religious direction, but I remember before I became partnered with my wife, who I love so much. I remember having conversations with pastors. I would go around, this was way before I had my show or anything. And I have these arguments with different pastors. And they would tell me, Steve, one day God is going to get you. And I'm like, okay. I don't think so, given my understanding of things, but I am truly open to the idea of divine communication. Maybe I can't rule it out. That'd be preposterous. I don't know enough to rule out something like that. But I did not have a positive belief that was going to happen. It just did not fit into my running belief system at the time. But sure enough, they were right. And I did have this experience that made me change my philosophy. So I had to incorporate the spiritual religious dimension. I have some of those beliefs. And I can interpret my experience through saying something like, God got me. Yeah, God actually did get me. So I think that openness is also important. Even if you're really, like with the concepts in heaven and hell, I don't think I'm going to end up there, but I've been catastrophically wrong before. So maybe we'll end up there someday.
That's awesome. Okay, so I have heard this explanation before, but I think it would be useful for you to give just a tiny explanation of what happened. Like, how did God get you?
Oh, okay, sure. So, yeah, the story is I think I had been fired from my job for the second time in the nonprofit world. I was doing video creation, and maybe it was the first time, I don't recall. Anyway, Julia is my wife, and I were dating, and I was living outside of New York City at the time, and I had to drive to Atlanta because I had moved from Atlanta up to New York City. I had to drive down to Atlanta to get my stuff and then drive back up to upstate New York where I was moving. And this is a long drive and it needed to be done soon. And so she helped me take the drive. On the way, we went down to Atlanta. It was great. Stayed with friends in Washington, D.C. on the way back up. And then I just had a love experience, a transcendental, divine, religious, life-changing experience where I realized for the first time that I loved her, and not in the sense that like I love bacon, because I do love bacon, but in a sense that I did not know existed. It was like the deepest thing I've ever felt. And at that moment, it was as if I was told from God. I don't know if this is literal or figurative, but it was as if I was told, Steve, as much as you love Julia, that's how much I love you. And it was as if God was telling me this. It was as if. I don't know if it was literally God. I don't know if this was a part of my own psychology that was giving me this profound information. I'm not sure, but it set me up. It totally blasted my brain open. I thought, okay, well, I guess I have to greatly expand my worldview because I had this experience I have to explain somehow. I'm not just going to brush this one under the rug. This demands explanation. So that was the start of it. And then it took me probably that was in 2011. It took me probably 7 or 8 years to start getting to the point where I am now, where I think I'm getting closer to deeper spiritual truths, which is understanding God as the universe and maybe as a person as well. Maybe if you put everything together, there is the universe, but that is also a person, which is kind of a funky concept. But yeah, that's the summarized version of the story. And again, like I've told the story now to several times. It's always weird because I never think of myself as being the guy going around telling this God story, but that's the way it is. Where was I going with that?
I don't know.
Okay. I don't remember. We're just going to let that one go. I guess that's the thing. I guess that's my new thing is talking about, yeah. Here's what I was going to say. Part of the reason it's a little awkward is because I don't expect to persuade anybody by this story. It's like the profundity of the story. I mean, it's interesting. It should be a data point. Because go, what the heck? That's, if you haven't had an experience like this, just be open to it because it actually happens and it's profound. If that's what's communicated, great. But for me, part of the reason it was so profound is because I know I was not looking for that. Like I've heard stories where people are searching for God, they're searching for love, they're searching for these things. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, you're setting yourself up. Okay. You're looking for the message in the sky. So you're going to see the message in the sky because you're seeking it. That's just the way, that's because I tend to be very skeptical by disposition. I have personal knowledge. No, I was not looking for that at all. Like this was not, I genuinely did not think things like this were possible. And so the way that it happened to me, I happen to have personal knowledge that made it that much more profound is because like, I really was not looking for this. And yet it happened. Now I have to explain it as a philosopher.
That's hilarious. Okay. So give a little bit, you said that you weren't looking for it, but what state were you in before? Were you believing in a God? Were you
good question.
away from that?
So I would have considered myself a deist. And so the atheism is the idea that there's no God. Theism is the idea that there's a personal God. Deism is the idea that there is something like a God, not understood in the naturalistic sense. I didn't have that idea at the time, but it's not necessarily personal. So this is sometimes called the Aristotelian conception of God. It's the answer to the infinite regress. It's the first cause, the prime mover, that type of thing.
Is that why it makes sense to you? Is that why you're not atheist?
Yeah. So I don't. Were you on the call when I was talking about the brief atheism story?
I don't remember. I
Okay.
probably was.
Okay. So, well, this is another funny story. So, I was an atheist, but I truly believe it was for less than 10 seconds. So, so here's why. So I started doubting the evangelical stories that I was told.
Mhm.
I was like, okay, I have a problem though with the argument from the infinite regress. You know, which is, is there an ultimate cause for everything, or is A caused by B, which is caused by C ad infinitum? It just goes forever. And I thought for logical reasons, you have to have a first cause. You have to have a first moment in time. You have to have a prime mover. I still think this is true, by the way. I think you can get to some conception of God through just logical reasoning.
Mhm.
So I was doing a little research, and I came across this video that I'll never forget. This one image that was on the video, and it was like a clock face or like a compass. It had it was a circle with a bunch of points on it, and it was like 12 different arguments against the existence of God. And one of them, I think it was number 10 or something, was the argument for the infinite regress. And I thought, okay, well, I'm interested in that. So as it was going through argument by argument, it was making really good points. And I was like, oh, dang, wow. It didn't make it it was like number 9 or number 8 or something. And I was like, wow, I think I'm going to be an atheist. And so then I was like, but then what about all these questions of the infinite regress? That doesn't make sense. So I get to the argument number 10, and the guy on the video goes, well, I made it this far. Like, I realized he was talking about his losing his faith journey. And he said, I went through these other arguments and found that they were lacking. So I figured then it must be that I just must be wrong about the argument from the infinite regress. If I was wrong about all these other ones, then surely the infinite regress was wrong. And then he continued. I was like, wait, no, you just skipped the argument for why the infinite regress argument is mistaken. Like, the one thing that I was hung on was the logic argument. And that one, he just totally threw up his hands and said, well, I guess I was wrong about everything else. So I'm wrong about this too. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, not an atheist. Can't do it. It's just, there's a logical problem here that nobody's been able to solve. So yeah, that was my position. Is there is a first cause, there's a prime mover. We can say amazing things about it. It must be unlike pretty much anything else we're used to, but it doesn't get you to any kind of personal relationship. God loves you. God is the type of thing that orchestrates love experiences. Doesn't get you any of that juicy stuff. It's just stuck with, like, there's an it's an impersonal creator. And then after, it was that experience in 2011 that I thought, okay, well, that's obviously not correct. Well, in my opinion, I don't think that's the most persuasive explanation for my experiences, because it was like I had a personal experience. So that pushed me more in the theism camp. And now I'm in something like a pantheism or panentheism, which is there is a God, there is some kind of personal relationship, and there is God is at least everything, and maybe he's everything. And if you you smush it all together, it's a person at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So do you believe in the personhood of God? Like, you're playing around with that idea?
I'm playing around with the idea. I think I have to say yes, because of the nature of my experiences. It was as if it was a person communicating to me. One of the troubles I have with that is that I think it's very limiting for the God conception. If God is literally everything, then personness can be part of God, but is personness, does that totally encapsulate God? Like, God in my conception also includes, the laws of logic, the laws of physics. And to say all of that is personal, I don't know. I feel like, at the very least, I think that God has an aspect to him which is personal and which can be experienced in some sense, or people can have experiences that are best explained by God being personal. But I just don't, I'm uncomfortable trying to lump the whole thing together in personness. But I'm not sure. I'm open to that as well.
Okay, so I've never thought about this, but there are some schools of thought that say that God is the universe. But what's interesting is that you're saying that if God is the universe and there's no personage in there, then how can he be personal?
Yeah, so let's put it this way. So I tend to think that philosophy is meant to explain our experiences. And I think we sort of start with our experiences. We say, okay, what's going on here? Why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing? And then we sort of develop a theory about the external world, the way it might work, theories of biology and physics to say, oh, I'm having these types of experiences because there's a world out there that works a particular way. So if God was totally impersonal, then I have a very difficult time explaining my experiences. But here's sort of a kind of a one angle to come at it. I note that in the universe, there are people. So that means at least one aspect of the universe is personal. Like the fact that there are people means that at least one of the things the universe can be is people. Right? Like, wouldn't it be weird to say the universe couldn't be personal and yet there are people in it?
So you're basically saying that because the universe, if we believe in a God, is a reflection of God, then everything in the universe has to reflect God in some sense.
In some sense, that every aspect of reality has to be an aspect of God. It just might not be the whole aspect. So it's not maybe like the whole essence of God might not be personal. And because I do think, in this particular conception I have, there is something divine in the physical world. That is to say, I think there is a physical world, and it doesn't explain itself. It has some. In order to explain the world, I think you need something supernatural. I think this for logical reasons, not because of any theology. I think it's sort of it might be necessary. I don't know if I'd say that confidently, but I think it's a persuasive argument. So therefore, like, one aspect of God seems to be the impersonal, seems to be the personal, because there are people. And then there are people who have religious experiences, and it's like the personal idea has some weight to it. But there also seems to be the impersonal. If I throw a bunch of paint up against the wall, I don't have to explain that by talking about persons. It just seems like it's non-personal, mechanistic behavior. So I think God has both aspects to him.
I hope that you found this episode enriching. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you would like to write a rating or a review, that would be fantastic. You can also follow me at Podcast. I'm looking forward to our next episode. Cheers.